Broadcasting from the business capital of the world, this is the Podcast Business News Network. And welcome back. We have officially started the summer of 2025. Thankfully, more people are into reading, like actually reading books. I was at the beach last weekend, and I'm not even kidding. This person couldn't have been more than like 22 reading a book. I was like, oh, this is fantastic. People are back into it again. It's a passion. And on the flip side of that, wouldn't it be great to write your own book? We're going to talk with somebody today who has written a book. This is a nonfiction book, and essentially the story of a mother, a son, love, and hope, all connected to letters that were sent many decades ago. Let's start with the man who is behind the publishing of that book and so many more, NFB Publishing. And Mark Pogodzinski joins us on the program. Hey, Mark, how are you doing?
Good. How are you?
Very well. And I want to thank you for all the great content, the great authors that you've brought before us. We have another one today. Who's that?
So this is Mr. Dan Joyce, who wrote a nonfiction piece about his uncle, who was a World War II pilot. And it's the story of his investigation of this person. And I think what really drew me into the book was we have this idea that these historical people are stagnant, that they did these historical things. But this book has so many great details about this person and humanizes them to the point where you know them. In particular, I like my favorite chapter is the one about his girlfriends, and that he had a life. He was a vibrant, dynamic person, and he was part of this massive historical event.
Wow. Dan, welcome. Thanks for being here.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
Interesting book in that a lot was uncovered, and this is about a World War II pilot who disappeared without a trace. Is that right?
Actually, he was a tail gunner. He wanted to be a pilot, and he washed out of pilot school. He ended up at the rear end of the plane instead of the front end, and a tail gunner on a B-24 bomber in World War II.
We're going to get into the story, your search for clues and all of that, but what brought this up? Obviously, it's your uncle. His name is Dan, correct?
That's right.
Yep. Name of the book's called Love, Danny. What made you want to dig into your uncle's life?
Well, it kind of fell into my lap, and it was, I felt an obligation to do something about it. I was named after my uncle. It was my mother's brother. And I always knew that, but I didn't know much about him because no one talked about it. It was a very painful subject for my grandmother, and it was not one that he could ask a lot of questions. If I would have had all this information now, I would have felt comfortable asking her questions, but it was such a difficult time for her and the family that once they received that, after several years, that kind of closure in their minds, that it was difficult to open it up. But she kept everything, every letter, every piece of paper, his draft papers, everything he ever had. And I knew about that, but I never saw them. She died at age 92 in 1998, and the box that they were in went to my aunt, my mother's older sister, where they sat for 20 more years. And as my aunt was ill and kind of, we knew that she wasn't going to be living much longer, the box came up a couple times and they kept saying they wanted me to have it because I was Dan and my uncle was Dan. So this was 2019. She died 75 years after Dan was shot down. He was killed in 1944. I got this box, and as it turned out, it was not just about my Uncle Dan. It had other things. It had my grandmother's 8th grade graduation certificate, all sorts of stuff. The funeral book that you get when people sign in from my grandfather's death in 1966 had all kind of stuff like that in it. And in the middle of it was this little, small ammunition box. It's ironic. I guess she kept it for a reason. Dan must have brought it home with him once to say, here, I'm learning how to shoot machine guns out of airplanes, and here's the ammunition box. Inside the box were all these letters and other documents, and they were kind of bound together. And here I am looking at it. I had no idea. I didn't, and they weren't in any chronological order, so I just started picking them up and started reading and piecing the story together. And the more I read, I didn't know what I couldn't have told you what a B-24 was back then, but now I can tell you where everybody sits and what the escape plan is and everything. The one that really took my breath away was there was one bundle that were all bundled together and they were marked missing. After he was missing in action, that's the main part, a large part of the book. They didn't unravel where he crashed and what happened to him for years. But because letters arrived after that happened, because they were written, anything that was written like 2 or 3 weeks before didn't get there till after he was gone. All those letters the Army kept. They stamped missing. They finally sent them all back to my grandmother. She didn't open them. She just put them in this thing. I was the first person in 75 years to open them and to read them. And among them was one of them from my own mother. Handwritten letter, of course, handwritten to her dear soldier brother, that I was the first one to read. My mother had been dead at the time. So my dead mother, this letter to her dead brother, I was the first one to read it 75 years later. So that kind of thing, I decided, it's a 400-page book, but really what it is, it represents a box that no one had looked at for 75 years. And that's not the way to do things. I wanted to bring that box to life and really share it for my family. It was not about writing, selling books. It was about honoring my grandmother and my uncle. And it's interesting what Mark said about how bringing the character to life.
He froze. Come back, Dan.
Well, you can tell how smart somebody is by how they write. So I, in a very weird way, almost 75 years after he died, I got to know this guy. And it was very, very fulfilling. It's very gratifying.
It's almost as if you wrote this book as, call it a gift to your family, because now you put everything together, right?
That's exactly what it is. Yeah.
Wow. How interesting. What was the biggest revelation, Dan, that came about in all of this? And we're going to go, deeper into the story, but what was the biggest surprise for you after accumulating all of this information?
Well, I think the thing that struck me the most, and I know that I ended up with the title Love Danny, but my original working title was A Mother's Heart, because I couldn't believe the determination and the extent to which my grandmother never gave up. And I think to the day she died, she probably held it. It was 99.999% sure, but it was never 100% sure. I think she felt that one day there would be a knock at the door and this guy would show up and say, I'm out of my coma, here I am. Because the way it took so long to find the crash site, the remains were, when you go to Arlington, where they're buried now, there's 6 names on the grave because there was no way to know who's who, and what was left wasn't much. It might be a kind of a macabre way to say it, but there's a letter describing that. One of the letters from another parent of one of the people on the planes had talked to an insider at the Army, and they said, look, there wasn't anything there. This is all we could kind of like piece together. They even mentioned in the letter there are no skulls. And so nobody saw the bodies. They didn't get disclosure of looking at a body and saying, yeah, that's my son. They just were told, it's all in this casket, trust us, and they buried it. And that didn't even happen. Arlington didn't happen until over 5 years after the event happened. They didn't find the crash site. And our Army didn't find the crash site until 4 years after the war ended. So that was, and so the letters revealed during those 4 years, obviously during the first 2 years or so afterwards, there were much more. She wrote to everybody. She wrote to veterans hospitals overseas. She wrote to the Red Cross. She kept bothering not bothering. They were very kind in return, but seeking more information, because I think she felt that they knew more than they were telling her, and they didn't know, but she felt that there was more to it. Another sidelight to it, a very, a coincidental thing that is that her brother. Now, my grandmother was the oldest of 11 children. They stretched over 20 years, and so one of her younger brothers was pretty close in age to Dan. even though he was Dan's uncle. He was 2 years older. He was a 2-year-old uncle when Dan was born. He was a B-17 pilot. He was over there. He arrived, he got sent overseas independently about a week or two after Dan went down, and he didn't know it. So here's my grandmother thinking, well, my brother is right there, 15, 20 miles away in another area. He can find out something. And he kept saying, I can't, I don't know. And she thought that she wasn't being told anything. Well, she was desperate. Her son had gone down. She got the telegram just saying, your son is missing in action. Sorry. And that didn't happen until 3 weeks after the event happened. The plane crashed on December 2nd, 1944. They telegram to her that they came in and said, sorry, your son is missing in action. That was December 20th, I think. For the months afterwards, she's trying to find out something. And like I said, her determination and her doggedness was incredible. The love for her son and not giving up. And she kept thinking, even if he was in a circumstance where most people, where he might, would give up, she wasn't going to give up. And that struck me. Also, the fact that I knew her as an old woman. She was maybe around 50 years old when I was born. She died at age 92. She was 38 she was a 38-year-old mother when this happened, and to put her in that position and see her write in that way and write about the family and her younger children, and it humanized her, and I saw a different dimension to her that I knew before. And so it was, in many ways, it was just so revealing. But in a larger sense, it revealed, and I say this in the book, this is not like, oh, this happened to our family, no one else has ever gone through this. Thousands, hundreds, this was happening in every city in the country, and that had a interesting effect, because you couldn't wallow and say poor me, because down the street or in other places people are doing the same thing, but there was a shared grief, everybody, but you really couldn't focus on themselves as much. Inwardly at home the tears flowed, but outside you had to say, well, like, hey, we're in the war, this is what happens. That dimension of it was interesting, because, and then it's also revealed in the letter writing, about 2 or 3 months after he was missing, the Army Department sent a letter to every family with a list of all the names and addresses. So the moms started writing each other. What do you know? What have you heard? And all those letters are interesting. And you got to see a little bit about their family. You got to see what happened in this country in wartime. And our younger generation today has no clue about that. For those of us who grew up with parents, my dad was a veteran in World War II, just at the end of the war. But we grew up with that. We grew up with the parades with the World War II veterans, and now they're almost all gone. And it's forgotten. It just showed what this country did. I don't know if we could ever do it again, but what this country did, in that box, there was the ration books that they used to get, to buy sugar and gasoline and all that. It was just a different time, in the way that the family and every family contributed to the war and effort.
It seems like every American was connected to the war in some regards, whether it was in a factory making something, whether it was watching children, whatever. There was a deep connection to it.
Sacrifice, a lot of sacrifice too.
A lot of sacrifice, yeah. Did you ever find out, with all the research, what actually happened on that day in Germany?
Yes. And in two ways. One, which happened toward the end, which added a last chapter to the book. But there happened to be 2 survivors. And I wouldn't call this a theme of the book. It's just something that kept happening. Is during my grandmother's, dogged, effort to find out something, it seemed like every time she found something, there was like this 1 foot, 1 step forward, 2 steps back. There was always some obstacle that didn't get her over the edge. And an example of that was, there's 9 crewmen. And as the plane, what happened was, they're on a bombing mission. This was my uncle's 7th mission. He only arrived there in October, and this happened December 2nd. He was there 6 weeks. That winter was terrible. It was cloud cover. England is notorious for that anyway. They were stationed in England. They would go over the channel. They could fly through Netherlands and Belgium, which are friendly territory, sneak into Germany, go down the Rhine River, drop their bombs, and go back. And so they did that a few times. This time they're going down the Rhine River, and it was cloudy. And the pilot was afraid of being in the clouds and maybe running into another plane because they flew in formation so close. So everybody was going to elevate above the clouds. His plane was very heavy because of the bombs. They got up there a little bit late, looked around, nobody there except German fighter planes coming at them. And immediately the plane got hit, burst into flames right in the middle. And a townsperson spiraled, crashed. A townsperson, we found out later, said they saw 3 parachutes. Well, after the war, and this was only several months after he was missing, 2 showed up. One, both in Army prisoner of war camps or hospitals. So there were 2 survivors. And from their record of what happened, we know about how they went above the clouds. There's a whole. I did a presentation at a Rotary Club and I read the chapter about and it described exactly what happened. And somebody said, "Well, how do you know that?" They all died. So, well, they didn't. I didn't make up one fact in this book. I didn't create any fictional characters. I didn't create any fake dialogue. Everything in there is accurate and is based on a fact from the letters. And the 2 survivors wrote kind of like this story. They had different stories because they did different things. They didn't even know each other were there until later. And they jumped out of an airplane at 25,000 feet, and it's freezing and there's no oxygen. They blacked out. So they didn't know what happened. They kind of woke up, fortunately, and these townspeople grabbed them and they got taken to prison. One was hurt very bad, burned very badly. Other wasn't so bad. But we know their story. But what intrigued my grandmother was, what is the 3rd parachute? And where is that? Where's the rest of them? And every mom was hoping that there's some hope. So, and that did not get resolved for 4 years, more than 4 years. And so that's what she lived with. Well, that's that's how I know. Well, it was from the account when they finally found the grave, the crash site. The Army had this effort, and I think they still do. And I think it's like every Marines will say, we never leave our boys behind. If even if it's a dead body, they take them home, right? Well, the Army had this thing called the Return of the Dead program, I think it was called. And they try to find every missing or killed in action soldier to at least give the family this. Do you want to keep them there? Like they have in Normandy, the American cemetery there. There's a big American cemetery in France. Do you want to keep the person here, or do you want to bring him home? Well, they went after. So it was 1948, and they must have known the coordinates of where this crash was, and they somehow found the little town along the Rhine River where the crash happened, and repatriated the remains, put them in a American cemetery in France, and then notified the families. And the families, because one of the families, there was one survivor that was pretty much intact, and they could identify that person. That guy went back to his hometown cemetery, I think. The 6 that they couldn't, that were all in one grave, basically, and ended up in Arlington. Well, so they named the name of the town. I'm sure, as I say in the book, my grandmother scrambled to a world atlas to say, where's that? Well, it was in the process of writing this, I said to myself, I think I'd like to go to that place. I think I'd like to find this place. So I'd finished the book. I thought I had finished it. And I went with a friend. We went to Germany. We went to the town. And I went to the tourist bureau. And I'd written them before. I asked the tourist bureau, do you know anything about a plane that crashed there in 1944? No response. I waited a few months, said again, no response. Okay. So I walked into the town, asked at the tourist bureau with the woman at the counter. I said, do you know anything? She goes, are you sure? I said, I'm sure. And she said, just a minute. I heard her talking to probably some old guy in town. she come back and she showed me a map. She goes, well, I don't know the exact location, but look here. And so we went there. There's a little chapel there. It wasn't even a town. It was like two roads intersecting and buildings around it with a little church. It wasn't fully satisfying, but I said, well, I guess this is around where it happened. But as it happened, we were staying at along the Rhine River there. These things go back centuries. There's these giant castles along the way. They used to be there for defensive purposes. They could control that section of the water, probably tax people or whatever. This one place is turned into like a 4 or 5 star hotel, and that's where I was staying. It was off season. It wasn't that expensive. But checking out in the morning, and the woman at the desk said, have you been to our museum? And I said, oh, nice. I noticed it was a museum, but during the winter, it was only open on weekends. This happened to be Saturday morning. We said, oh, let's check it out. So I went in, and this guy's there. He's seemed to be about my age, maybe a little older. And he was not just the clerk, he was the curator, creator of this museum, to tell the history of that location of the castle and how it was. It goes back 1,000 years, this place, and some of it were ruins. Anyway, and I'm looking out the window from where this is, and where I look at the window is exactly where we were the day before, showing what I thought was the crash site. And I said to the guy, did you grow up around here? He goes, yes. I said, do you know anything about a plane that crashed there in 1944, right out there? And I'll never forget the way he looked at me. He goes, that plane crashed in my grandmother's yard. I said, what? He goes, but it wasn't there. It was up there. And I said, and he showed me on the map, on the book, there's, I have a thing of the book here. I don't know how well I can see it. That's his X. He drew that X to show me exactly the same where it was. So it was right. It was a couple hundred yards away. A golfer could have hit a golf ball there, probably from where we were, or if you're a far shot. Anyway, so we went there, and I stood there and I found it. Oh, well, the other thing he said, and after he said that, and he said, just a minute. And he went to his bookshelf. He pulled out this family scrapbook and all pictures from his family. So opened it up to one page, and in it is like an aerial photo of the villa that his grandmother lived on, and family photo. Down in the corner, a photo, like a snapshot photo of a crashed plane. The plane crashed and I could tell exactly where it was. Like, I lifted my jaw off the ground, and that's why I said, can we go there? So we went there. So I ended up standing. I'm the first person ever in my family, I'm sure, person ever who found that out.
Wow.
So at the crash site. I wondered, like, well, where was that other place? The other place, I realized, if a plane crashes in your yard or your grandmother's yard, you just don't bury the enemy soldiers in your garden, right? You say, get this out of here. So they probably took the bodies, put them in that little church cemetery or what it was, because that was probably the only like neutral place to go. It wasn't that far away. That's what was noted in the Army records. They weren't saying where the crash was. In fact, I looked back more carefully, said the crash was in the vicinity of that place.
My God, this is just a fascinating story that, like, it's just you never know what's coming next. We're almost out of time. Mark, I got to ask you, I've posed this question to you before in terms of editing manuscripts and material that you've got. How did you even, these are all factual accounts. I guess maybe the way it was written, but a lot of it is the letters that you're not going to touch. What was the process to put this all together?
Like you say, you don't want to touch anything that's real. So it was just putting in the proper order, making sure that everything flowed and it was easily readable, because the story itself did not need to be touched. And then you can hear from Dan's description the passion that went into it. So again, it's my responsibility and my honor to make sure that the book flows the way it should. It should look the way the author wants it, and it should tell the story. And the story itself is just, it's wonderful, it's tragic, it's heartfelt, it's hopeful, it's everything that you need. So that was my responsibility.
Just amazing. And we didn't even get into his love life, that section. And I do want to add here, as we close today, that he left his home to join the Army, the Air Force, on Independence Day, 1943. Just, talk about a patriot. Talk about what we owe in terms of our independence to your uncle, Dan. Thank you for sharing the story today. Amazing. I feel like I'm part of your family based on your account. That's how descriptive and interesting this story is. And it echoes many of those stories, from that time. My dad also part of that war. Thank you both for being here today. NFBpublishing.com is where you can find more about the book. And also, if you're thinking about writing a book, you can get the support for that as well. Again, thank you both for joining us today. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Steve.
Thank you.
Thank you. We'll be right back.
Bye.
Broadcasting from the business capital of the world, this is the Podcast Business News Network.
For nearly 2,000 severely injured veterans, everyday life has become filled with barriers.
Day-to-day simple tasks can become pretty daunting.
I have to carry my chair up 2 flights of steps or have somebody do it for me.
What scares me the most is just the falling.
When I'm struggling with my house, I think, to have that one great barrier just knocked down, it's crucial.
Home for Our Troops is a wonderful nonprofit that builds a
Mortgage-free, fully adaptive, handicap-accessible house. And there's no catch.
It'll be our very first home that we've ever owned. This is a game changer.
This is where your life begins again.
We need you to join us in completing this important mission. Please visit hfotusa.org and help build homes and rebuild lives.
Because of you, everything's going to be okay.